Hello, everyone. I'm Nathan, and I'm a developer. Developer. And over the last couple of years, I've started to really realize the importance and the value of communication. And that's why I'm giving this talk today. Because one of the things that has really helped on that journey is the power of admitting you don't know, and the kind of culture that that can create when you make that an okay thing to do. Now, I phrased it as the power of admitting you don't know, but it is really a mindset, so bear with me, and hopefully by the end of this, you can walk away with some useful things yourselves that you can apply in your development roles. So, primarily, admitting we don't know can be difficult. We're obviously knowledge workers. We sort of cut our teeth on knowing very, very specific things about very difficult and complex subjects, and we're in a field where it's very easy to feel like you don't want to be the guy who knows least in the room, and it's important to sort of justify that probably handsome salary you're on by appearing to know pretty much everything. So turning around and having some guy stand on stage and say, "Oh, tell people you don't know stuff," you may think, "Yeah, convince me." And that's the idea. The idea of saying I don't know, I firstly completely recognize that whole mindset, it's difficult for us to do. For junior developers, they get a golden ticket. For junior developers, it's very easy for them when they're in a company to ask obvious questions, maybe silly questions, and just point out obvious things and say things like, why is it we do it that way? And actually, you could even score some points with your management because they could turn around and say, "Oh, yeah, we didn't think of that. That's an interesting angle. We might try that." And let's get this guy on a fast track to somewhere else or something. Whereas if you're actually established and you've been in that role for a while, doing the same thing, you might think makes you sort of be the odd one out, makes you stand out from your peers. By definition, the junior guys don't have a reputation to worry about, whereas if you've been in a company for 18 years or even a few years, you maybe do. So, yeah, they'll be keen to impress and perhaps even more likely to ask those kinds of questions, which, implicitly saying, "I don't know how these things work, could you explain them to me?" But for the rest of us, well, we might feel a bit more hesitant. Established developers may feel like they need to have already know this thing. Perhaps they're looked highly upon by their peers, perhaps we're looked highly upon by our peers, perhaps we're in senior roles and turning around as a senior developer and saying, "Well, actually, yeah, I don't really know why we do it this way," or "I don't know if we could improve it by changing it to this or that or something else." It might look like, "Well, why don't you know? You should know, you're the senior developer," or something, or "You've been here for so long, like, why wouldn't you know?" And rather than trying to see what happens when we come out with that mindset of saying, "Well, let's challenge the way things are done," just sort of keeping it to yourself, or the common one is saying, "Well, read this documentation or read that book or look it up or something," is the kind of subtle way, of less direct way of saying, "I don't exactly know, but read this thing and hopefully you'll find out." You perhaps don't want to shatter this well-established reputation, and that's completely understandable. And the same way as juniors can ask these questions, you might not want to put yourself into the category of looking junior. So I'm encouraging you to think about breaking that mold and be a bit of a leader, really, in saying and changing a culture perhaps in your team or in the wider company of saying, "I don't know," but it comes with caveats. So obviously use it sparingly. I'm not saying that every time we don't know a thing, bother someone on the chair next to you and ask them to solve it for you or to give you the answer. But I am saying, having done your homework, if something doesn't make sense, be willing to challenge that thing. Don't assume that everybody knows, because it's being done that way, that they know necessarily why it's being done that way. Maybe it's just the way things have been done, and the actual guy who put it in place is long gone now, and actually the time's ripe for change. As I said, the classic, read that documentation or check this book, is often an indirect way of saying, I actually don't know. So don't be afraid to ask. You might find that your peers also want to know the same thing. And I've seen this many times, and it's kind of why I'm giving the talk, where I've said in front of a group, but hang on, that doesn't really make sense. Why would we do it this way when we could do it that way? And people have said, yeah, I was thinking that too. And then suddenly there's this whole chorus of people in sort of similar agreement, and suddenly we're having a discussion about a different way of doing something that until then was just the way it was done. I worked for a company called Tomra, and they built some really interesting machines, actually, and I was working on the software side of them. And they sort of sort things. So if you imagine fruit and veg, carrots, peas, stuff like that, where they're chopped up and put into bags, if they've got marks on it, they fall down a kind of chute, and if it's bad, it gets blown by a jet of air and put into the reject pile. These guys had been, they're a really big company. They had been involved in lots of mergers and acquisitions. Lots of different people had worked on the code base, and things were becoming brittle. This code base had been extended over a very long period of time. It was working between different countries, different teams, people with very different ways of working, and honestly, communication wasn't as good as it could have been. And people basically had this sort of classic, if only it could be rewritten under my auspices, then this would be fantastic and amazing. Because as it stood, reacting to change, reacting to movements in the market or requirements from the client had become really, really difficult. So we had a very, very talented team of developers. Some of them had, a lot of experience, and they really, really wanted a chance to redo this thing from scratch. And it was a serious bit of software. Well, their wish was granted. And this wasn't trivial. I mean, this was hundreds of millions of euros involved. This was a European company. So that's quite something. When you've been going on and on for so long saying, give us the chance to rewrite this and it will be amazing, and a company turns around and says, you know what, we've had a discussion, green light. Analysis paralysis. Suddenly you've got the whole company from different countries looking at you. You've got this huge budget assigned to you. You've got a free hand on who you pick and who, basically in control of your budget. And you're thinking, what? We do not want to screw this up. And that's fair enough. It's a very big responsibility. There's a lot of money involved. There are a lot of people's reputations at stake. I joined this team a couple of months into what it turned out had been just research. With that weight of responsibility on their shoulders, they were very much thinking, we need to make sure we've researched the best way to take control of this and to move it forward. They needed to make good of this wish that had been granted. Well, some of the things that happened there was when I joined, I sort of told them, look, estimating is hard. Recognizing what we're going to do next is hard. And yes, you've been sat down for months looking at what to do next, how should we move forward. Let's just admit we don't know. Let's not deny this thing and try to pretend we do. Let's just shatter that illusion and say, look, we don't know. Let's knock up a prototype. Let's do a thing, get some feedback on that thing, and then decide how to make that thing better. And maybe even tear it down. Maybe it's a complete write-off, but we've learned from it, and maybe we get some ideas on architecture or on what things are really more valuable. So yes, estimating is hard, but the easy way to solve that is just do a thing. Do something, and then have a better idea. The more you've done that thing, the more you can estimate how long that thing's going to take to do and how long it's going to take to improve. The fear of being judged can, and did in this case, really cripple progress. People were so immensely worried that they were going to let down the company that with the best of intentions, actually nothing was getting done. And it was so empowering just to say, like, look, we don't know, that's okay. Let's just try something. That's why I'm sharing it with you guys. Psychological investment matters. When you're involved in that sort of delivery, when you've got that responsibility, and okay, this was a giant project and we may or may not be fortunate enough to work under those kinds of stresses, you do feel like a personal investment. You do feel like you don't want to let anyone down. And that's understandable, but trying things, turning around and saying, we don't really know what to do next, but maybe you guys try this and we'll try that, and trying things out by committing to that mindset of saying, it's okay to not know things, can really, really have a positive impact on what we do as developers. Failing fast is useful. Doing something and finding out, actually, that wasn't at all what the client wanted is an okay thing to do. It gives you feedback. It gives you a chance to say, okay, well, it wasn't good because of this or because of that. Let's improve that thing, or let's start it, from scratch, but with this thing in mind now. Rather than trying to plan up front for months or years in some cases, or even just weeks, actually just trying things, failing fast, admitting you don't know, and learning by doing. We have to remind ourselves how useful this is, because this is how we as adults now have learnt to do everything we know how to do. It's the same way you see little kids fall over when they're learning to walk and stuff. They're just trying. It's how we learn language. It's how we learn everything. It's by not having an ego and worrying about what happens if we get found out not knowing. Prototypes also help change expectations. Showing a customer, a client, even your team, a working thing can really raise morale, and that's exactly what happened with us. It was so nice to see this team that had been under so much pressure to say, oh yeah, we've got this working thing, and if we did that, we could add this, and we could add that, and suddenly it was like a totally different conversation from, being able to cut the tension with a knife in the room to excitement. Just briefly, the Apollo missions are a similar example of what I'm talking about here. They knew their target generally was the moon, and a 1% error in their calculations would mean they'd be 4,000 miles off course. The way they corrected, because they were 97% of the time off course, was by feedback mechanisms. It's a kind of streamlined versions of saying you don't know, but we'll correct as we find out more. They're moving, okay, that's not quite right, let's correct, we're moving, and eventually, obviously, Apollo 11 was a success. It's that feedback mechanism from admitting that you need to know more, from welcoming input and feedback that allowed that to be a success, and I think it's relevant to what I'm talking about. It requires feedback, it requires a willingness to adapt, and so we need to encourage that, and we can start that by being the first guy in the room to say, well, actually, you know what, I've been meaning to challenge that for a while now, why are we doing it that way? Almost mentally saying, I don't know, and I'm happy to admit that. So, some key points summarizing. It's absolutely normal that too much choice can blind you. It's absolutely okay when someone's saying, okay, we've got to do this thing, and you've got a year to do it, plan it, for you to say, what? That's okay. We're human. We feel the weight of responsibility. We want to be accurate. What we do generally is very accurate. Having to sort of do a voodoo dance and hope that things work out, and okay, by month 3 we'll be here, and month 4 we'll be there. It's completely natural that you're going to feel sort of tense or stressed in that situation. But saying, we don't actually know. Could we try doing this, see how long that takes? Could we maybe have a little sub-team work on this area, like an A/B test or something like that? Fail fast, get that feedback, steer course, sort of like the Apollo 11 mentality. That can deliver and has delivered and continues to deliver success. It works. We can use forcing functions to do this. So in the same way that we can sometimes plan for months at a time, and some teams go down to a couple of weeks, you can even bring that down to a couple of days and say, what can we do in a day? What can we do in, say, 3 days? Let's fail quickly, if we fail at all, which, by the way, often doesn't happen, so we can get that feedback and know what to do next. If we can encourage that conversation by being the change we want to see, by fostering that culture of people admitting out loud, actually, that doesn't make sense. Can someone explain that to me? Why are we doing it that way? We can make an environment where that becomes normal, and we can all start to learn from each other and correct course accordingly. Prototypes, again, these sort of quick, knocked up, a couple of day type prototypes, they help you, they help the team with morale, and they help the customer see that progress is being made. So, finally, when you admit you don't know, or when you subscribe to the mindset of being open about not knowing things, it makes it okay for both you and others that you're with, and hopefully maybe even go so far as the wider company, to be honest about the reality of things. And it's with a clear picture that we can make good progress. This can foster the environment of questioning things, being prepared to change things to suit us better, to suit our clients better, to suit the work we do better. And it allows you and others to grow. So I hope that that's useful for you, and I'm Nathan. Thank you for your time.